Hello, everybody listening. My name is Alex Vidas, and I chose to do my journal club presentation on a paper by Benjamin Freeman and Elliot Miller. The paper is titled "Why Do Crows Attack Ravens?" and the Roles of Predation Threat, Resource Competition, and Social Behavior between crows and ravens. Some important background to get into before we start talking about crows and ravens is this concept of interspecific aggression. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the aggression or agitations that happen between two different species, typically resulting in some sort of scuffle or fight. It happens in a lot of different places with a lot of different, it's especially common in birds, as we've seen in previous research. But it costs like food, energy, and it can cause some pretty devastating injuries in the species that get involved, of course. And I should highlight some pretty important trends when it comes to interspecific aggression that we see pretty often in animal behavior. Um, IA is typically asymmetrical. So ravens are not, agitating crows 50% of the time, and vice versa. Another thing we typically see when it comes to IA is that it tends to happen between species that are ecologically similar. So we look at crows and we look at ravens, and they're pretty much the same animal. The only namely difference that they mention in the paper is that the raven, compared to the crow, typically weighs 2 to 3 times more, which can give it a bigger size. And finally, IA can actually be seasonal. There are periods of the year where like aggression is more common between two species, and we can observe that statistically. The people behind this paper are expecting breeding season like springtime, and like winter periods when territory is more rare, food comes by a little less often. They're expecting those sorts of things to come into play, all three of these. But just for some more background on interspecific aggression, there are several reasons why that behavior exists among all animal species, and we are also going to try and relate some of these to crows and ravens throughout this paper. The first reason behind IA behavior among all animal species is that they might mistake each other for members of their own species. So, if we want to relate this concept to ravens and crows, very easy to, maybe not be able to tell them apart. If a crow attacks a raven, we can assume that it's a non-adaptive behavior for no real reason other than the crow thought that it was another crow and it was just fighting for territory or food. The second reason we might discuss is that food and space resource disputes between each other, they're very ecologically and geographically similar species. They live in pretty much all the same areas, and namely the only difference being the raven's weight compared to the crows. They might want to fight for food and space just like any other animal would. Our third reason that we might assume IA between these two species is that crows might want to free up space from their predators, which are the ravens. So ravens have actually been known to sabotage crow nests. Um, and our fourth reason that we might assume IA between any animal species is that when hybrid mates are possible, a hybrid offspring but might actually result in reduced fitness, a decreased fitness. And that's just not what animals want. So an adaptation that animals have made to that over time is to just kind of attack each other. And that kind of results in their species staying strong and fit, and not creating any hybrids that result in a reduced fitness. The researchers pointed out that since we already sort of know about the relationship between them and we've observed this aggression between crows and ravens with our own eyes, we can actually debunk some of these options before we even get into the data collection for this experiment and start making assumptions and questions. So, for one, crows and ravens likely wouldn't mistake each other for members of their own species, namely the weight difference between ravens and crows. But also, crows are very social creatures, and more often than not, if a crow sees another crow, they're not going to attack each other because they're just social like that. They roost together. They're very often found next to each other. And you can see ravens next to each other, and ravens really don't pick at each other either. I mean, if you see roadkill on the road and there's ravens there, or crows there, they're typically understanding of each other that they're all just trying to get a quick meal. And four is debunked because the last common ancestor between ravens and crows was actually 7 million years ago. So their likelihood to actually have a hybrid offspring at this stage, with genetic differences, even though it doesn't look like much, is likely not happening. And we haven't observed this happening anywhere. So we're just assuming that they're not going to create a hybrid mate that has any reduced fitness. So our aim is to kind of use this example to better understand aggression in all animal species. Um, it's a particularly good example noted by the authors because they are so closely what seems related. I mean, they look identical and they have identical behaviors. And I'm kind of steering us towards the author's research questions here. So the very first question that we're going to ask Is interspecific aggression between crows and ravens asymmetrical? So if we remember the trends in IA, we noticed that that number is typically a bit skewed. It's typically not 50-50, and we expect it to not be 50-50 between the agitators in crows and agitators and ravens. The second question that we're going to ask is, does the direction of interspecific aggression depend on the number of individuals involved in the interaction? So when we put a number to it, are we going to see more fair fights between one crow and one raven, or are we going to see more examples of what's called mobbing when multiple animals attack one animal because um, there's typically some advantage to it? And our third question is, does interspecific aggression between crows and ravens vary seasonally? So are we going to see more aggressions happen during breeding season, like spring, or are we going to see maybe less aggressions happen during that month? Or when we put a number to it, what's that going to look like? So they're admitting to not having enough data or not being able to collect enough data just on their own. I mean, they're just two people in a lab. So how were just two people in a lab able to gather sufficient information to approximate the interspecific aggression between crows and ravens across an entire continent? I mean, so what did they do? They took to a website called eBird. It's a citizen science program where you can kind of take the date, the time, the location, the species of bird, and leave comments on it. And the authors of this experiment did a manual scan of all the eBird checklists, but they came to a total of 307 100,000 records of crows and ravens actually mentioned in the same comments. They had to dig through all of them and find the passages with two criteria, very important criteria that had to have been clearly met. For one, the entry had to have mentioned an aggressive encounter between crows and ravens. And two, it has to mention which species was the aggressor. So, but that narrowed it down to a total of 2,014 observations from 307,000. The data that they compiled from these eBird checklists were um, the aggressor species, so which species like agitated the other species, the target species, the date of the encounter, the geographic location of the encounter, and if possible, the number of individuals of the aggressor species and the number of individuals of the target species. So, as far as methodology, that's about as extreme as the authors get. We're already under our results section here. So, if we remember that first research question that the authors were asking, they wanted to know if the IA between crows and ravens was going to be asymmetrical or not. And the authors did indeed find that the IA between crows and ravens in North America was highly asymmetrical. Crows were the aggressor in nearly all, about 98% of the contest between these two species. And if we remember our second research question that the authors wanted to answer, that was based on whether the amount of individuals in the aggressor species or the target species had any impact on the likelihood that IA would happen between crows and ravens. And this second table, you can see it labels aggressors, crow, and ravens. Obviously, crows, 98% of the contests, they're going to start most of them. And we see that their strength in numbers side of the table where they had where there were more crows than ravens, we actually saw 1,300 of those interactions. Fair fight interactions was under 300, and when they were outnumbered, there was actually only 20. So we can see that the more crows that there are, the more likely that they're going to want to mob another raven just because that they have the firepower to do so. Let's take note of this table one more time. Unfortunately, we only have like a couple handfuls of raven aggressor, data entries to even work with. So to answer the third research question is they only used American crows as aggressors. And now giving us a chance to look at these graphs with this in mind, we can see that March, April, and May were hot spots of the year for crows to be the aggressor against ravens. And ironically, this is exactly when their breeding period is. If we look over here at this graph, this kind of highlights where the aggressions happen based on your latitude or where the observation was locationally. Latitudes like 40 and 45, they start to kind of peak in November and December during like the earlier winter months. These higher latitudes, the trend starts to begin later in the year. We're going back to our first question now to discuss if the IA between crows and ravens in North America was asymmetrical. We definitely saw that crows attack ravens 97% of the time. That was the author's final number. They're comparing ravens to Goliath and crows to David in that famous David versus Goliath scenario. They see their size in numbers as an opportunity to fight back against the ravens that might have an easier time claiming territory and food. And now for some discussion about the second research question. Based on the direction of IA, depending on the number of individuals involved in the interaction. So, what we gather is that crows are very social, or at least a lot more social than ravens. And since ravens are bigger, they might simply just not need to be aggressive. They might just have an easier time, ecologically, just finding food, space to breed, and all that comes in between. What the authors are calling this an example of is a socially mediated dominance reversal. And so, lastly, this third research question, does the IA between crows and ravens vary seasonally? So, the majority of crow attacks happen in spring, March and May during breeding season, and most attacks, crows on ravens, are specific to April and May. There isn't enough data, as I mentioned, to make any claims for the interspecific aggression on for ravens on either species of crow, but we do still see it happen year round. I mean, there's no month on this table here where it doesn't happen. So we definitely see breeding season is a reason for some of these fluctuations to happen during certain months of the year versus non-breeding seasons, such as later summer or especially the winter months when these numbers aren't as high as they are in the spring. But we do still see it happen year round, and the authors did want to make very careful note of this, and that some of this behavior might be non-adaptive, like I mentioned earlier, especially at higher latitudes when food is harder to come by, territory is harder to come by. They might just want to, beat out another crow just for another chance to eat. In these lower latitudes, it's a lot more likely for us to experience aggressions, and we can kind of pin this on the fluctuating patterns of like migrations and certain parts of the year where in winter we don't see any activity compared to early activity early in the year at some of these like mid-latitude areas. But what the authors really want us to take home is that the IA between crows and ravens does vary seasonally, and we can see that with a very heavy impact here during the breeding season. I want to leave you guys with just a larger significance for this paper and its foothold in the larger realm of animal behavior. The first reason I have listed out of a handful of reasons was this paper's application of interspecific aggression to ecologically similar species. We now have a better understanding of interspecies interactions, and we just have new findings that can promote more coexistence or potential coexistence between species that, really just don't like each other. But something that this paper is the first to do is to apply this idea of interspecific aggression to an entire continent. It's hard to be everywhere all at once, and it's hard to also get an accurate profile of interspecific aggression across an entire continent. Um, that kind of takes me to my third point here, that their use of citizen science to cut down labor-intensive experimentation was, groundbreaking. I would say they're very resourceful for this. They're the first study to use citizen science to collect data for an entire continent, which just makes this experiment possible. And finally, their use of data science mapping technology to spread out data samples geographically. Even after upsampling other data, nothing between the graphs before and after upsampling had changed anything. But it's an honest projection of the future of data science and mapping technology in the research of animal behavior. Um, Thank you for listening to my journal club paper, and it was nice talking to you.